Good evening, everybody. My name is Anthony Tamburri, and I'm the Dean of the John D. Calandra Italian American Institute. And I want to welcome you all. I'm sorry that I was not here in June to celebrate 50 years of the Telos Institute, or the Piccone Institute, but I was in Italy. I was in Italy. No, we have a seminar, proving seminar with diaspora, so it coincided. I'm just delighted that we were able to do that in June to celebrate 50 years, and I just want to, an anecdote. I did my doctorate at Berkeley in the 70s and early 80s, and in Italian studies, which tended then to be quite traditional. And so the idea of a thinker, as young as he was back then, a thinker like Paul Piccone, an Italian running around thinking the way he was thinking, at least from the point of view of Italian studies, especially literary culture, cinema, was sort of an anathema. There were many of those thinkers. You could find them occasionally in poli-sci, maybe, and occasionally in history, but definitely not in Italian studies, as we call it, or as in Italian it's called Italianistica. Those of you who know Italian and know the Italian system, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say Italianistica. It's narrow. So it was great. I was walking down Telegraph Avenue one day, walked into a bookstore, and I saw this journal, and it had this name Piccone on it, and I was wondering who this Italian was. And I followed it ever since. So it's, for me, it's just a pleasure when Maria and I finally met a few years ago, and we collaborated with a few projects back in Italy. It was just wonderful for me to be able to be part of this, as peripheral as it is. So I'm delighted we're able to host you tonight. You can consider this a future site as well, as long as one of us, the staff, is around. The Institute is always open to the Piccone Institute. So, Maria, it's all yours.
Anthony, again, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to host here. I have fond memories here as well. Obviously, in June, Telos celebrated its 50th anniversary, so I'm still on this 50th high until June. It certainly is an honor for me when I took over as publisher back in 2004, and to have Paul's students take over from editor, book line editor Tim Luke, and now David Penn, soon to be the editor. It's certainly a huge honor for me. So I want to welcome you all tonight and enjoy the weekend. It's going to be a fantastic conference with some amazing keynote speakers with Eugene Rivers and Wayne Hudson. It's going to be great. If you have any housekeeping throughout the weekend, feel free to reach out to me. I will be at the Deutsche House tomorrow, Saturday and Sunday. So welcome again, and to a successful conference weekend. And special thanks to Adrian Pabst for organizing this conference. I also want to give a special acknowledgement to our staff who's helped organize from the office. Rob Richardson, who does an amazing job both on the journal and the Institute, amongst other tasks that he does. So I just want to acknowledge you, Rob, for all of the work that you do for the journal, for the book line, for the Institute. Without you, you're like my lifeline, so thank you. And also to Jennifer Wang, one of my interns who's been with me for a few years. I'm really proud of her, felt her accomplishments as well. So without further ado, I will call on David Penn. So thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I'd also like to thank Mary and Anthony for organizing this event and hosting us. And starting out, as editor of the journal, I'm I guess a little bit kind of awed by the prospect. Russell's big shoes to fill there, and I really just hope that I can live up to Mary's expectations of this. What I want to talk about today, in terms of introducing our panel, is actually a topic that I spoke about. It's almost the exact topic about 6 years ago. This was in 2012, the Telos conference, and I don't know if you recall, this was the first one where Wayne Hudson appeared, right? And
It's never been the same again.
And he had some particular critiques of what I had presented then. Hopefully I've thought things through and things are better for him now. And other people recall, this was also our kind of renegade conference where the Friday evening presentation was done in a bar down on Houston, right? Because our venue had been pulled out from under us. So that was a memorable conference. And I'm returning to this theme of culture and politics by talking about Carl Schmitt and Walter Benjamin. Now, so, what I've kind of, basically what I've done in the meantime is I've been thinking through this problem, and I'm working it out in terms of a book manuscript on Schmitt and his cultural theory. And I guess I'll start, and I'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then we have a panel to sort of extend this discussion and try and apply or contest some of the things that I come up with here. Okay, so in his constitutional theory, Carl Schmitt argues that a constitution embodies the unity and order of the people in its concrete existence. In the same way, and this is a quote, in the same way as the song that a choir sings has its unity and order not in the specific people in the choir, but in the song itself and the musical score, the unity and order of a people is to be found in the Constitution. End of quote. This is from Schmitt's constitutional theory. In making this argument, Schmitt is insisting on the representational quality of political unity, which is to say that the Constitution is not so much a collection of laws as an aesthetic representation of the people in its unity within a particular vision of order. The Constitution must be understood more as a song than as a legal document. And the understanding of political unity that a Constitution implies must depend on a process of aesthetic creation and judgment. Schmitt's constitutional theory consequently intersects with a cultural theory developed by Walter Benjamin about the way in which a political unity is established through a collective interpretation of a past history that links it into a contemporary context. If literature depends upon a process of interpretation, a recasting of the past in terms of the present, then this process also lies at the heart of both the establishment and the continuing existence of a constitution. Such an understanding of a constitution dependent on aesthetic judgment rather than political reason or practical reason considers how the representational process of political identity establishes the foundation of legal principles. So Schmitt's conception challenges some basic liberal beliefs about the character of law. His idea that the Constitution must reflect the unity and order of the people in a representational way contradicts the notion that law should be organized around universal principles that would be based on kind of a natural law of reason. In making this shift, Schmitt focuses on the will of the people as constitutive for law, even if this will might contradict liberal principles such as the protection of individual rights. At the same time, the treatment of the Constitution as similar to music indicates that it is not simply a question of following people's immediate desires. Rather, the aesthetic quality of the Constitution means that it reflects people's judgments about their identity. These judgments are not organized around self-interest, but reflect disinterested judgments about key values. Disinterested does not mean universal and objective, however. If aesthetic judgments do not reflect self-interest, they also do not imply a unity of metaphysical perspective. Instead, diverse judgments about art and about identity can be equally disinterested.
But even if these judgments are disinterested, Schmitt's idea that laws are based on aesthetic judgments is a radical and potentially dangerous departure from a conception of law that sees them as founded on rationally developed objective principles. In some ways, we might consider Schmitt's argument against liberalism to be parallel to the way in which the Protestant Reformation challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. In both cases, a universal perspective on order is being criticized for not being universal, opening up the possibility of competing notions of the metaphysical foundations of order. As opposed to a liberal approach in which individual rights are held to be the basis of law, and law is in turn the basis of political order, Schmitt contends that the liberal conception of rights is not self-evident nor scientifically grounded, but is part of a metaphysical framework that must establish itself against competing conceptions. Rather than seeing liberal order as the natural culmination of the progress of human history, he sees it as still constituting one alternative amongst many, each of which must establish itself within the collective will of the people in order to gain legitimacy and become the basis for a political and legal order. For Schmitt, a theological framework grounds a political stance, which in turn becomes the basis of law. And he criticizes liberalism because it does not recognize the way in which both politics and law are consequences of a theological perspective. While he often treats liberalism as if it did not have such a theological basis, at other points he recognizes that liberalism, in fact, does contain a metaphysical perspective based in the idea of natural law. But liberalism, in setting up this idea as the guarantor of order, generally refuses to treat the natural law tradition as one metaphysical perspective among many. Consequently, a liberal perspective considers a constitution based on natural law as the only legitimate one, because constitutions must be based on a rational understanding of the true nature of law and therefore cannot be rooted in a specific political or theological perspective. In treating its own particular metaphysical perspective as if it were scientifically objective and universally true, liberal political science obscures the political theological character of its own principles. Liberalism consequently contains for Schmitt an absolutist theology that, like the 16th century Catholic Church, does not recognize the possibility of alternative theological perspectives that might be the basis of law, and denies the political moment in which it pushed aside such alternatives. They are only treated as heresies, that is, as deviations from truth. Now, Schmitt's critique of liberalism is consequently based on a disagreement about metaphysical foundations of politics. If liberalism's principles are established upon the basis of its imagining of a state of nature, Schmitt's own principles are based on his imagining of the state of exception. The state of nature is a situation prior to the laws of men and is characterized by either a condition in which there is no law, Hobbes' war of all against all, or in which there is a natural law of men that, for Rousseau and to a certain extent Locke, grounds a fundamental harmony in human relations. In all these cases, however, the state of nature provides a common starting point from which natural law and then the proper human laws can be deduced. It is a state prior to culture and to the human differences that would confuse the issue of rationally grounded laws. John Rawls, for instance, in the 20th century, still uses the conceit of an imagined ignorance of one specific character and position in society in order to come to conclusions about the universal basis of justice, even if he does not speculate about an original state of nature. Schmitt's state of exception is fundamentally different from the state of nature because it does not abstract away from human culture and the differences that it produces, but rather assumes that these differences are in fact at the heart of the problem of human law. When Schmitt asserts that sovereignty depends on a decision on the state of exception, he assumes that the basic problem of sovereignty is to choose amongst competing alternative theological perspectives, each of which would lead to a distinct ordering of human affairs. Because there is no rational way to make this decision, the decision itself must be the foundation of order. In beginning with the state of exception, Schmitt then begins with the human not as a natural being, but as through and from the very beginning, a cultural being. The cultural character of the human means that every human, no matter how primitive or in what situation, already exists within a specific cultural order with a set of metaphysical commitments. Whereas the state of nature for Schmitt is a mere myth, he can point to historical situations such as the English Civil War or the Weimar Republic as really existing states of exception in which there is an active conflict between alternative theological perspectives on order and sovereignty. Schmitt's argument is that those situations come about when a normal situation with a clearly established metaphysical perspective on order breaks down into competing perspectives that undermine the stability of sovereignty. Sovereignty and a stable order can only then be restored when there is a decision on how to resolve the state of exception by clearly defining what constitutes the legitimate order and what threatens that order. As a result, the decision for Schmitt is also not a moment of naked violence, but a moment of the establishment of order based on a particular theological perspective. When Schmitt points to the way that the norms that constitute law are based on the exception, he assumes that there are no philosophical first principles that are prior to a cultural ordering of the human. This cultural ordering is part of humanity itself, which does not exist outside a specific set of metaphysical assumptions. Such assumptions are only a set of imaginings until the point where they start to structure decision-making in the world, and this begins with the decision on the state of exception that establishes a particular political theology. Norms, consequently, cannot ground in order, but are themselves consequences of this decision. The decision is necessary only when a particular order faces an existential threat to its survival. This survival in some cases refers to physical survival, as in the case of Jews and their establishment of Israel after the Holocaust. In other cases, it is a question of the survival of a way of ordering human relations, as in the case of the struggle in the American Civil War over the future of slavery as an economic structure. In both cases, though, the political order must establish what it sees as a basic level of homogeneity in order to maintain its own identity. If the Nazis saw their racism and anti-Semitism as their most important principle, which they used to define the homogeneity of the nation, Israel has established Judaism and the Hebrew language as foundations of its identity as a political order. The anti-slave states in the American Civil War also refused to accept heterogeneity with respect to the question of slavery, and the war established the principle of equality as the basis for a homogeneity of values in the United States. As different as these different examples are, they all demonstrate that the decision on the state of exception involves a decision about what is most important for collective identity, and consequently the possible enemies of that understanding. In designating the enemy, the decision is setting the parameters for the form of homogeneity that defines the political collective. For Schmitt, then, every political and legal order must have a particular orientation that implies an understanding of what would threaten the basis of that order. This understanding of order only crystallizes and is established when a decision is made that which makes that order impossible must be forcibly excluded. In this sense, the decision, in fact, creates the state of exception. In the case of the American Civil War, the war might have been avoided if the northern states had decided that the secession of the southern states did not constitute a state of exception. The insistence on pursuing a war to establish unity and thus homogeneity was a decision that defined the situation as a state of exception that threatened a particular understanding of order. An understanding of order based on American unity and equality had to acquire a conceptual and spiritual existence motivating war before it could become a material reality through victory in that war. Consequently, the decision must combine an ideal and a material aspect in order to become a basis for sovereignty. The key issue for Schmitt in analyzing this decision is the question then of who decides. On the one hand, Schmitt argues that sovereignty ultimately lies with the people, and that they are the source of the decision. On the other hand, he also contends that the people cannot speak with one voice, and in fact cannot become a single political entity unless they have a representative who speaks for them. These two considerations lead Schmitt to develop a theory of representation in his Roman Catholicism in Political Form and Constitutional Theory that seeks to solve the problem of the way a people constitutes itself as such. Here, he does not just mean the kind of democratic representation. When he talks about representation, he does not mean the kind of representation we talk about when we think of elections and parliaments, however. Representation is for Schmitt a process by which a group of people comes to an understanding and agreement about their collective political identity. While such identity depends on the real existence of a people, this people must also agree on that smaller group through which they feel themselves to be representative. Thus, Schmitt imagines a dialectical relationship in which the ultimate sovereignty of the people must always be mediated by a smaller group, for example, a monarch, an aristocracy, or a parliament that represents the people to itself and thereby constitutes it as a political unity, but in which the representer is also dependent on the real existence of that people. Representation is not just a matter of delegation because the representer of the people must also establish a higher form of being through which the people might see itself, not just as a numerical mass, but as the embodiment of an ideal notion of being. As Schmitt puts it, representation establishes a higher form of existence by making the invisible into something visible. The people must see itself represented as something noble that would motivate them to embrace and defend a particular notion of themselves. This can only happen in an aesthetic process because the materiality of the people is insufficient to define the higher form of being to be defended, and there is no objective rational basis upon which to ground this form. At the same time, Schmitt insists that the representation cannot be a merely aesthetic event. It must have a materiality to it in which it is linked to real decision-making and events in the world. Establishing the terms of this merging of ideal and material becomes the primary goal of Schmitt's work, in which he tried out several alternatives for linking representation to materiality, a cultural theory with a political theory. The difficulty is that there is a sort of a chicken and egg problem in the relationship between identity and representation of the people. Schmitt affirms that as long as a people exists and has a will to continue to exist, that people will be able to establish the formal structures of its existence. But if sovereignty only comes about through the decision in the state of exception, this people cannot exist as a collective will without some representation that already explicitly and formally defines the people as sovereign and thus existing in the world. In constitutional theory, he tries to mediate between these two poles by distinguishing between the principle of representation and the opposing principle of identity. According to the first principle, a people cannot constitute itself without a smaller group that would represent the people to themselves as a unity. According to the second principle, the small group depends on the people themselves as the audience that ultimately decides about the viability of the representation as an aesthetic unity. While monarchy emphasizes the principle of representation and democracy emphasizes the principle of identity, Schmitt describes the ways in which both forms of government must contain both principles. Even a democracy needs a demonstration of its basis for unity, and even a monarchy needs an audience for its representations that would confirm their legitimacy. The difficulty with this situation is that it focuses the difficulty with this solution is that it focuses on the materiality of the people without developing an aesthetic theory of representation. In constitutional theory, Schmitt affirms that as long as a people exists, its, quote, life, power, and energy are inexhaustible and always capable of finding new forms for its political existence, end quote. He then develops this idea of the inexhaustible power of the people in state movement people in order to ask whether a government bureaucracy, a judicial system, or a party can effectively represent the otherwise mute will of the people. Moving away from a theory of representation, he then argues that this collective will is grounded in race and that the party is the only true interpreter of the people's will. As with other Nazi theorists at the time, Schmitt uses the supposed material objectivity of race in order to avoid developing a theory of representation, even though the Nazis clearly made representational strategies into a crucial part of their rule. By ignoring this aspect and locating the basis of unity in the materiality of race, Schmitt participates in Nazi propaganda and leaves the problem of representation unresolved. Later on, his Leviathan and State theory of Thomas Hobbes attempts to shift the focus of attention onto the state's responsibility to protect the lives of its citizens. But by restricting the goals of the state to the preservation of life, Schmitt here undermines the idea that the decision on the state of exception has a metaphysical element that defines a structure of order. Instead, he interprets Hobbes in such a way as to focus on physical survival rather than representation as the fundamental basis of politics. Later on, he pursues a new mode of materialist justification for order when he turns to land appropriation as the creator of order in Nomos of the Earth, and to the partisans linked to the land as the basis for legitimacy in theory of the partisan. In all these attempts to ground the collective will of the people in a form of material existence, either race or physical survival or the taking and holding of land, Schmitt ignores the aesthetic aspect, preferring to find a seemingly more objective basis for order in a form of materiality. He pursues a more aesthetically oriented approach in Roman Catholicism and political form and in Hamlet or Hecuba, in which he focuses on the Catholic Church and on Shakespeare's Hamlet as representational structures that establish a link to existence and materiality. In both these texts, however, he does not grant to aesthetics any kind of independent functioning that could explain the way that representations gain legitimacy based on their form. Instead, he argues in Roman Catholicism and political form that the Church's legitimacy derives from the line of popes that lead back to the body of Christ as the material anchor for the chain of representation. Similarly, Hamlet or Hecuba focuses on the allusions in Hamlet to the day-to-day politics of King James I's ascent to the throne as the basis for the sense of the tragic in the play. In both cases, Schmitt substitutes a reference to a material reality for an aesthetic explanation for the representational power of the Catholic Church and of Shakespeare's tragedies. He is thus still unable to solve the problem of how a representation can establish the unity of the people. So if Schmitt established the connection between sovereignty, decision, and representation, he was ultimately unable to explain the way in which a representation might function to ground the sovereign decision that establishes the unity of the collective. For such an explanation, we must turn to aesthetic theories that explain how representations fulfill the desire for meaning in a way that affects action and decision-making. Because he works within the framework of Schmitt's theory of sovereignty, Walter Benjamin was one of the first to develop such a corresponding aesthetic theory. In his Origin of German Tragic Drama, Benjamin begins with Schmitt's thesis about the decision as the basis of sovereignty in order to argue that the fundamental aesthetic problem for the Baroque era was the destabilization of sovereignty introduced by the Protestant Reformation. Once the Catholic Church lost its monopoly on truth and meaning, the world lost its self-evident character as being linked to a divine authority. Instead, the confessional wars led to a lack of clear sovereignty, leading to a situation in which decisions on the state of exception became impossible. For Benjamin, the aesthetic form of this situation was allegory, in which the things of the world lost their clear tie to divine meaning, and these things began to act as arbitrary signs that could be manipulated and mobilized for a variety of purposes. Their availability as allegorical signs was the positive aspect of their fallenness as objects that no longer could claim to have an inherent link to truth. At the same time, German tragic dramas tended to depict weak and problematic sovereigns and were unable to arrive at representations that could establish a positive vision of the kind necessary for establishing sovereignty. The Baroque era becomes for Benjamin the negative example that demonstrates the way in which sovereignty depends upon representations to establish political unity. Once he lays out the representational backdrop for the impossibility of sovereignty, Benjamin then indicates that Shakespeare's tragedies formed an alternative possibility for sovereignty by laying out the possibility of transcending the conflict of ideological positions that dominated the Baroque era. Focusing on Hamlet, Benjamin argues that the play lays out a vision of a future state of freedom, even as it exists within the fallen state in which this freedom is not possible. In this way, Hamlet is able to prefigure the representational framework within which sovereignty can be reestablished in the future. The mechanism here is an aesthetic construction of meaning that can then become the representational basis for sovereignty. The key for Benjamin's theory, though, is the way in which Hamlet stands at the intersection between two modes of meaning in which the link between the two is established through tragic sacrifice. If martyrdom in the German tragic drama reaffirms the inescapability of the fallenness of reality, Hamlet is able to escape this situation by prefiguring a new mode of meaning that creates a structure of sacrifice rather than martyrdom. The sacrifice occurs because Hamlet is unwilling to accept the parameters of the fallen state, of the fallen situation, even though he still lives within this situation. His protest against his situation leads to his sacrifice, but the sacrifice itself then establishes a kind of negative image of a better world to come. This structure of sacrifice can then provide the basis for the kind of representation that could then establish a new form of sovereignty for the future. Benjamin's approach lays out the representational prerequisites for sovereignty. First, there is no original sovereign moment. Rather, the establishment of sovereignty consists of a kind of double movement in which an existing mode of sovereignty is depicted as fallen in order to present the outline of a new mode of sovereignty that could replace the old one. The decision on the state of exception thus requires a reinterpretation of an existing mode of sovereignty, and the decision needs to be understood as an interpretive activity as well as a productive one. Because it requires an interpretation of an existing situation, aesthetic meaning becomes the prerequisite for an effective representation. The success of an interpretation depends upon its ability to arrive at a convincing revision of an existing way of seeing the world, and this revision must make sense to the audience. In his theses on the philosophy of history, Benjamin describes such successful interpretations as weak messianic moments in which the continuum of history is broken up in order to release a new image of the past that accords with the form of order to come. He refers to the way in which Republican Rome was cited during the French Revolution as a source of meaning from the past that was mobilized in that present to create a new structure for sovereignty. Benjamin consequently links Schmitt's decision on the state of exception to his idea of the time of, to Benjamin's idea of the time of the now as the messianic and miraculous moment that transforms the present through the creation of a new interpretation of the past. If Schmitt insists on the materiality of the decision as the point at which violence is used to establish sovereignty, Benjamin focuses on the way in which this sovereign decision does not originate out of nothingness. Rather, the decision constructs a collective identity by moving it out of an existing situation through a convincing reinterpretation of the past. To sum up then, if Schmitt establishes the way in which a political order originates out of a decision that puts an end to a conflict of metaphysical positions, Benjamin reads this decision as the culmination of an interpretive effort. Together, they lay out a framework for conceptualizing the critique of liberalism as the modern equivalent of the Protestant critique of the Catholic Church. If the Catholic Church once had to shift from a violent suppression of heresy to an accommodation with the different forms of Protestantism, it may be that liberalism today is at the point where it must give up on the goal of establishing its supremacy at the end of history in order to establish working relationships with alternative perspectives on political order. Accordingly, liberalism may be able to function as the Catholic Church already does today, as the framework for a version of universality that can offer itself to the world through its example without insisting on a suppression of alternative views. In the face of the possible shift of the world toward a coming class of civilizations, liberalism might still offer a framework by which individual cultures might be able to reinterpret their own history in terms of its values and principles. Thank you. So, we've got panelists, I guess, now to sort of to discuss. Just we start on that end.
It's because Adrian doesn't want to
I don't want to
Hold the
start.
mic close. Hold the mic
Yeah,
close.
well, I'm fairly loud. I'm a preacher. David, your talk was so provocative and exciting. Now, I am a Black Pentecostal. Now, that probably doesn't mean anything to you in here, but I come from the high-octane wing of the low church, the Black church. And it was amazing to me, and listening to the themes that you wove, one of the first things that occurred to me is that, based on the analysis, if I understand it correctly, Martin Luther King could have been a Schmittian. It's fascinating when I think about it because, one, King challenges the ideological hegemony at the philosophic level of liberalism. He's not a Rawlsian. His philosophy is embedded in a robust Christian political theology. And this is very interesting. You say some powerful things. Within the context of the Black world, what would have been more fascinating in your next iteration of this brilliant talk? You will not end the Civil War where it didn't end. The termination of, military war was not the end of the war. It just shifted to a new form of war, right? The Clausewitzian kind of deal, right? So we've got the secession, technically, of hostilities, which then, in some sense, during what was called Reconstruction, got shifted to the Blacks. Then there was a subsequent re-enslavement of Blacks, which is, again, war, right? And so we would have needed to, in terms of your historiography, to extend the analysis to King, which is and the Civil Rights Movement, which is the next major iteration of the conflict. It's very interesting. And one of the things that happens, and this is true on the left and the right, is that there is this factually inaccurate understanding of the nature of the conflict. Because, and see, the thing that made my head explode, there's no other group of people in the United States for whom the political form has been more dramatically mediated by the artistic and aesthetic form. You cannot talk about the entire struggle, beginning with the Civil War, and proceed through Reconstruction, the Nadir, the lynching, and all of the creative music that emerges and creates this interesting kind of sensibility. And for Black people, the aesthetic imagining and the idea of identity at its best is rooted in a universalism, which is in essence also simultaneously particularistic. So that the conception of the universal is mediated through the lens existentially of the particular. And for Black people, given their condition, that's unavoidable. There's no way you can assert the universal in a situation where you're getting blacked up and your particularity is nothing but a problem. What does it feel like to be a problem? And so you've done something I think, quite fascinating. And the discussion around the Civil War and whether or not the South had legitimate claims I love that. Because then we must push the question further. Well, if the Southerners have claims, would the slaves have claims to have seceded and gone to war with the South? Since the ultimate political aspirations of the South was not simply to extend to the West and call it a day. We now know, and there's a vast body of literature on this, they had planned to go to South and Central America and extend what was the South to the southern tip of South America. And so, there would have to be some creative way that we engage this Schmittian idea in terms of looking, because I'm with you. Identity is indivisibly connected to sovereignty, and where there is no coherent conception of identity, I can't be free. You know, it's sort of like the psychopathology of internalized racism, which constricts my ability to have an imagination to see new possibilities. So I'm going to shut this thing down. I don't mean to preach, but so when we talk about these messianic moments, well, you're talking to the black church. Well, we do that. We do messianic moments. we do that, right? And then what's fascinating about King is that in that messianic moment, he provides this robust historiographic reinterpretation of the entire American project. That's the whole point in the King speech in Washington in '63. He said, all I'm asking is that you keep the promise that you made. Right? You did not honor the promise. You violated what should have been a covenantal relationship. So I am excited. I'm going to shut this thing down. There's more stuff I want to say. But I think there is an enormously productive engagement with the most dramatic experience, which is the slavery thing up to the civil rights movement and where we are, for a creative appropriation of your man Schmitt. And then, on the last point, on the aesthetic thing, we begin with Benjamin. Okay, we can start there. We'll start with the Germans. But then again, we got to take it higher. Got to take it higher. Because, you see, as I'm thinking, I'm saying, well, you've got Benjamin. He's an aesthetics theorist. Then you have the theorists in the black community. One of the people who was an interesting theorist in terms of aesthetics, and nobody's ever recognized it, was W.E.B. Du Bois. During the 30s, Du Bois is making all of the connections. He buys the identity piece. He believes that there's got to be the sovereignty of a people, because they argue, well, at least for us, there are two countries. There's the United States, and then there are 20 million people of African descent who represent, and it's a people within a people. And see, and on this point, there's a vast body of philosophical literature that all good liberals and a lot of conservatives have never engaged, beginning with Du Bois's conception that we're a people, we're a nation with a nation, which is where Genovese went. And most people haven't read Genovese, read it carefully. Roll, Jordan, roll. He's got an amazing chapter on the religious foundations of the black nation. And he says that black people are not a race. They're not a race. They're a people. There's a difference. All right? So I think that you're onto something fascinating. All right, let me get these notes, and I'm going to shut this thing down, because we're going to get time for our other colleagues here. What's your idea of representation? Sterling Stuckey, by the way, is another one. He'd be a Benjamin for black people, a guy named Sterling Stuckey who just passed. And the thing about aesthetic representation, there's no group that's had a greater need for a sense of aesthetic representation than the folk that have been maligned for the last 500 years. Fascinating. So, thank you very much. This is amazing. I am excited. I almost feel like I'm in church, but I'm going to tone that down right now. Oh, man, this is incredible. Oh, wow.
Well, I'm going to get on with Eugene, because people who know me will see many parallels between the Australian extremist and the black preacher. And the sources are the same, because I have as much evangelical low church in me as I have high church Russian Orthodox.
Praise the Lord.
So we're going to get on. The only thing is that we're going to sing. There's not going to be any address tomorrow. We're going to sing the songs. I'm sorry, that was a joke. In American
I got it. I got it. No, I got you. I'm with you, Doc.
Takes a while.
I'm with you, brother.
Yeah, you're with me. No, I'm going to say about three things, because I have another go tomorrow. I agree with everything that Eugene says, and I agree particularly about the Genovese. And if you haven't read The World the Slaves Made,
Come on.
go and read it. It is a masterpiece.
It's a masterpiece.
And if you don't know Du Bois, you better read that too. I agree completely about that. And I do agree about the Civil War, and I'm prepared to argue against Charles Kahn that his understanding of those matters is not only wrong but wicked, and that he cannot explain what actually happened in the Civil War, and that he cannot illumine the crucial fact that the South was right on every essential point of political theory. Wrong in morals, wrong in everything, certainly wrong in theology.
Yes, sir.
But very solid in political theory,
Yes,
a
sir.
good Republicans they all were. I'll talk about that another day, quoting the Americans who wrote about that. I also agree with him about the need to know the books written on subjects. That'll come up tomorrow. I'm always criticizing everybody in every conference I go to in the world because they haven't read any of the books about the things they talk about. Well, I haven't either. But it is a bit of a weakness, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
It is a bit of a weakness. I've only got about two more things to say. I thought David's paper was brilliant as well and extremely perceptive on the conceptual links. I only want to say two things. The first is that if we talk about liberalism, we have to historicize it, and we have to discuss it country by country. Because when David talks about liberalism, an Australian like me can't recognize anything he says, because, of course, we never had liberals of that kind. And Italians never had liberals of that kind. And Russian liberals, I don't know how many Russians we have here, but if you know the Russian liberals, the idea that they thought any of those things is simply crazy. So we have to notice liberals are different in every country in the world, different by language, and different by particular structures of oppression. They're all operating structures of oppression, but they're not the same. And the account that appears in David's talk of liberalism, which is Schmitt, not David, of course, but it's bizarre on a global level. It's bizarre to think that liberalism had something to do with the idea of the sovereignty of the people. Second point is about the history of law, and I may come back to that tomorrow, because again, unfortunately, I'm a lawyer. My background is in jurisprudence, and because I'm an Australian, I was brought up on American realist jurisprudence. So I never had any of this bunk about normativity or Immanuel Kant. I always knew it was about money and power, and I only needed to know how to get more. So the Australian point there is just two quick points. Realism in the Australian tradition makes it impossible to read books about law in the United States, except a good one recently called The Force of Law, which I assume you read the Harvard book on The Force of Law. But the other point is, of course, we're common law. Now, everything Schmitt says is absurd if you're a common lawyer, because none of the things he thinks apply to law and applied to the medieval law apply to the common law. Common law never had the idea that there'd be rational principles behind law. That was the last thing that was ever said by any common lawyer. And the argument continues. Now, I'll come back to that tomorrow. But it's not just that he can't deal with the common law, he can't deal with the Orthodox Church. He never deals with the Orthodox Church. But what does that mean? He means he misses the Roman Empire. He talks about the Roman Empire, but he's got the wrong one, David. He's got the wrong Roman Empire. Because you need to have Byzantium. And you need to have the whole history of Orthodox-shaped law. The book on that is McGuicken, one of the greatest books of the last 100 years, showing how Christianity created Byzantine law. And the Russian Empire has nothing to do with it. Sorry, we have to get Mr. Putin shocked, but it's nothing to do with Byzantine law. But the important legal development was Byzantine. And then he said, oh, but the West is what really matters. Well, I'm sorry, but you've got to remember that Rome spoke Greek. You've got to remember that Irenaeus of Leon spoke Greek. You've got to remember that the monks in Ireland spoke Greek. In other words, this whole shibboleth of a Western tradition, a legal tradition taken from German canonists, is nonsense. And the idea of the Roman Catholic Church, well, since I'm Catholic, I'll spend 6 months telling you why that's nonsense. And if you think that anybody believed in God, Schmitt believed in God. He was a German barbarian. German barbarians believe in God, G-O-T-T. Deus doesn't mean God. Theos doesn't mean God. Christian church never taught God. This was a German barbarian idea. I admit it spread around a bit. I've only got one last thing to say, and then it doesn't affect David, it does affect Schmitt, but it doesn't affect David. Of course, Schmitt's enormously important in America, and I agree with David completely on that. because this is a country that never got its ideas straight around the problem of Rousseau and the problem of Kant. There's no good book by an American on either of them. There's hundreds of books, they're all totally wrong, because Rousseau is completely disastrous, and we never agree with him on anything. And Kant is a genius and the founder of really the first great metaphysics of freedom. Americans think he was against metaphysics. I'm sorry, you haven't read the text. He's founding a metaphysics of freedom. All the good German books show that. There's even one American book showing that. Well, when you get that clear, then you can see that Schmitt is very important in America, because he leads you to a realist analysis of politics when you haven't got it. It leads you to a realist analysis of international law when you haven't got it. The problem is, if you convert from Kant, wrong, Rousseau, wrong, Schmitt, you're still in trouble.
Praise the Lord.
Well, it's interesting you describe yourself as the high octane of a low church. Yeah, I belong to a religious community that is highfalutin and I'm the low octane. We're definitely low octane. I want to make very brief remarks on your very interesting and provocative paper. I'm going to just start very briefly. You know, the view that my ground or idea of sovereignty, yes, no, the view that my ground for sovereignty is the one true ground for sovereignty is itself, of course, one argument among many. Because there will be people who don't choose your particular ground, but more importantly, the idea that there is a true ground for sovereignty, and it's only a matter of who wins out in the moment of emergency or exceptionalism, who wins out in deciding it. So the idea that there is one is itself one worldview among many. There are perfectly possible other worldviews which don't have the idea that there is one ground for sovereignty among, and it's a matter of the competition for who gets to say which one it's going to be. So that idea itself is situated, highly situated. It's not, I completely agree with both Eugene and Wayne, but I think it's not only liberalism is situated from country to country, but the idea that what we're doing is competing for one view. And so there's going to be a fracas until somebody steps up and grabs the microphone and makes the decision in decisionism, is itself completely situated in time and place and continued in that sense. I have something else here scribbled in my tiny handwriting. For those of you who know me and my work, so I'm struggling with grounding a way of living, not particular tax policy or how you vote for whatever parliament you're living in, but the foundational ground from which particular policies would emerge. That I've been working on how to develop that foundational ground or framing from something that is not this fracas on the idea of there are competing blah 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 and someone has to grab the microphone, but rather in something more like, I'm glad you used the word covenant, right? What is an ontology of one ontology might be covenantal and or relational or something, but I think that the task that we have at the moment, looking at our stellar politics in this country and in other countries, is to understand that the premise of liberalism is highly situated. The premise that there's one premise is also highly situated, and that we need to go much deeper in looking for ontological ground for how we frame as the background resource or undergirding framework for then how we develop particular policies. And I would just close with one thing, that for those of you who are very sensitive to the argument, is it ontology that should ground how we live, or is it teleology or telos, as where we are, should ground it? I would say that they are inseparable and mutually constitutive. Ontology grounds telos, telos emerges from ontology, and that's what we need to be looking for. And the rest is culturally contingent.
So I thought I was the high church, low octane person, but that's already been said. So I suppose I would just add, having travelled over today, that I'm both physically exhausted and now intellectually exhausted just listening to my colleagues. It's been so intense, and I think it's a real tribute to David's paper that it's generated these responses. And what struck me in particular about his paper is really the sheer clarity with which he establishes these really complex connections between representation, identity, the question of sovereignty linked to law and constitution. And I thought it was really an exemplary exposition of what Schmitt and Benjamin are arguing. I suppose I would more want to comment on where I think neither Schmitt nor Benjamin go far enough. And of course it's easy with hindsight, you might say, but I think it is important because whilst I thought the critique, as David has laid out so clearly, Schmitt's critique of liberalism, continues to be really, really important, precisely because it highlights this lack of realism. There is another element I think that is missing. So the lack of realism is vital because ultimately the liberalism that Schmitt talks about, which is not, of course, the whole liberal tradition, and Wayne is absolutely right to highlight that, but the liberalism that Schmitt talks about is nominalist.
Yes.
It's profoundly nominalist. It's something where where liberals assume universals are only in our mind, and we somehow project them onto reality. We see some resemblance in reality, but the only universality lies in the mind. That is, of course, a form of nominalism that, taken to an extreme, is very dangerous, because you essentially strip any ontological commonality of all things out there, and you assume they're just individual substances. And then there may be some resemblance. All of us may bear some trace of humanity, but that's just a mental concept. It's not in us. Or treeness, or tableness, or any universal form you may have in mind. So that I think is really vital, and I think Schmitt makes that point very powerfully. But what's missing is that the other element of liberalism, which I think Schmitt doesn't completely disown, and that is voluntarism. And that is really important because, again, voluntarism taken to an extreme is a very dangerous position. Voluntarism is essentially saying that the will is the more important faculty than the intellect. And then if you take that a step further, you're essentially saying that the power of the will, right, trumps in some sense, intellectual information. And then if you take that further, the individual is essentially, independent from all others. So again, you can see how nominalism and voluntarism will reinforce each other, because they both end up in a position where individual substance is completely stripped of all ontological commonality. And of course, will divorced from intellect becomes very dangerous because it's no longer directed. Right? And that, of course, again, can lead you to much more extreme positions, like sort of will to power in the way that each very uniquely identified as part of the modern condition. So I think that's what's missing in a critique of interest, because I think decisionism, remains voluntaristic. There is an element of voluntarism in the kind of Schmittian decisionism, which I think is problematic. Because whether it's the ruler, whether it's the monarch or even some aristocracy, or the people, that act of will not only, you could say is exceptional in a Schmittian sense, but in fact, not even that happens. Because to constitute a people or a nation or a country, and even a sovereign state, there isn't that act of will. And even revolutionaries, in the end, have to work with certain traditions, with certain institutions. The American Revolution was a change of political regime, as was the French, this wasn't the great liberation, emancipation of the people. I mean, this is, this is sort of history 101. And therefore, I think one should be very careful not to use, I think in the way that decisionism ends up doing, this idea of, the will of the people, somehow the people, is quite monolithic. And again, of course, that's the profound problem in Rousseau. So I think, we have to be much more critical, I think, of voluntarism than perhaps Schmitt was, as far as I know from his work. And then I think the other thing that I think is missing from Schmitt and from Benjamin as well is in relation to the aesthetic dimension, which, again, is a crucial point to make. I mean, I think this idea that you can have an account of sovereignty or identity or the constitution without aesthetics is nonsense, and hence the argument of the paper is so important. Without aesthetics, this does not work. But what I find so strange in Schmitt is this complete dismissal of romanticism. As if somehow, as Schmitt says, romanticism is actually in collusion with liberalism. They both need each other. So romanticism needs liberalism because otherwise, you don't have the sort of rational counterpart. And liberalism needs romanticism because otherwise, the self cannot be sort of included in a high unity. But I mean, first of all, I think that's nonsense. And secondly, I think what the Romantics did argue that I think Schmitt completely forgets is precisely the idea that we are rational as well as emotional, but more importantly that we have moral sentiments and that we are profoundly connected to nature, to the cosmos, to something that is transcendent. Whereas I think there's a kind of oscillation in Schmitt between wanting to get away from positivism, which is right, but then always in the end, sliding into some sort of transcendentalism. Right, where this kind of, this moment of decision is the sort of thing that grounds it all. That, to me, is a sort of transcendentalism I think is very hard to overcome on Schmitt terms alone. And you need romanticism to get back to a sense of kind of transcendent cosmos, a sense of a covenant, and the idea that actually it's not just the true or the good, but also the beautiful. This helps you to kind of mediate this transcendent reality. And so, those are the elements that I think are missing. And I don't think that Benjamin had that appreciation of the romantic tradition either. So these are sort of the missing elements that I would want to throw into the conversation.
Yeah. One of the things I almost jumped out of the shower when you drew the connection to the aesthetic. And because this was in the context of the Weimar period in the dialogue. One of the things moving forward is that the creative appropriation of Schmittian categories and this idea around the aesthetic and aesthetic identity is part of representation. Well, there were some foolish ways that people attempted to address that within the context of 50 years ago in the various liberation movements, right? There were these attempts as these folk struggled to develop these single-state command economies that were based on some ridiculous stuff in the Soviet Union, on and on and on. But aside from all of the obvious flaws, there have been, for people, seeking freedom, this idea of developing an aesthetic dimension to their definition of peoplehood, right? If I'm black, I've been told I'm butt ugly for the last 500 years. So in my quest to assert autonomy, I'm going to reimagine myself. Now, one of the things I'm thinking about, a lot of the practical work, my 9-to-5 job, is working on a think tank and then working with gangs. I've done that for the last 40 years in some terrible places. And the idea of developing a healthy, taking very poor, marginalized kids who hate themselves. I mean, there's an internalized psychopathology before Fanon. Black people understood that, right? There's got to be a more creative way that we think through aesthetics and break out of a sort of parochial conception of that. Because I work with young people, I follow hip hop. So I've been, I've followed hip hop for the last 40 years. And there's some creative, artistic, absolutely ingenious things that most of the white left. Now you've got goofy people who romanticize it because they're simple, right? And people do that. But there's some very sublime, important aesthetic dimensions that the mature left has to embrace. As you were talking, it was wild, right? John Coltrane flew in my mind. I said, oh my God, I'm at a Telos conference talking about Schmitt and Benjamin, see, and John Coltrane jumps up. So I said, oh, that's so powerful. That almost makes my brain hurt. John Coltrane, right? Or Miles Davis. And my point is, those are two iconic figures that have functioned in a universal way, mediated through the particularistic expression of an art form that in some deep sense began in the black church and the slave traditions. So there's some enormously powerful stuff, and your point about the political theory of the Southerners. Genovese said, look, pound for pound, they got an argument. Now, morally, if you cannot be free to enslave others. You're gonna have a bad hair day, right? Trying to force that idea, and then sooner or later it's gonna catch up with you. And so I think that there are some remarkable political and philosophical opportunities for Telos to undertake some very brilliant interventions, just to do some new things that nobody saw coming. It's like your Schmitt thing. Yeah, when the Schmitt volume dropped, I was in the store, I hollered. I said, no, they didn't. I said, I know these white people didn't do this, right? Put Schmitt on the cover of Telos, right? I said, no, they didn't, but I loved it, right? Because it was creative. It was a curveball nobody saw coming, right? I mean, you shook things up. Well, with Muhammad Ali, I shook up the world. I mean, you shook up the world, that Schmitt thing, right? I think that there are some similar things that can be done now. See, and one of the things that Telos has to understand is how powerful your appeal has been. See, I'm an outsider, so I'm watching the thing, right? So since I'm sitting on the margins, I can sort of watch how the thing plays out. You guys have had some killer interventions, and if you can expand it, and then you at some point you have to commercialize the thing so you get out there on newsstands. But you've got some very powerful ideas that nobody on the left. Now, and this thing, what's this? This thing about this, your Civil War line, you see right now, the whole racial thing in America is about some unresolved issues that go back that far. The left, liberals, got the story wrong philosophically. And so you had a lot of stupid stuff. I was just in Birmingham, Alabama, 2 days ago. Surreal. They have not talked about Martin Luther King for 60 years in Birmingham, Alabama. It was so deep. I'm there and I go to some Baptist college, so we do a talk, and I asked some white seminarians. They had said they knew nothing of King. In Birmingham, where they bombed the 4 girls and blew up the church. So my point is that this discussion that you raised about how we reconfigure the historiography of the country, because that's really about getting the country's narrative straight, right? And so I think you guys, hats off to you. You've done a brilliant job. There's some enormously powerful things. This Schmitt deal and the aesthetic thing can go deeper. And I'll say this: you want to break with the white left tradition, and you want to try to engage the most powerful art forms that produce, which is a jazz thing. How do you miss Coltrane and Duke Ellington? How's that work? And call yourself civilized. I mean, I'm not joking actually on that.
You got questions? Can you listen to? Yeah. Go. Yeah.
No, I'm going to speak as the low-octane atheist.
God bless you.
But that identification does not speak to what I'm going to ask. Just a couple points. One, David, I agree, right, with your talk. right? Has excellent coherence and so on and so forth. I think we're on the right track, totally. I'm a little bit concerned as a historian that you tend to take some Schmitt's things out of context. In other words, where you jump from one theme to the other. But we can take that up in more detail at another point. But a point of clarification would be, you use three terms: political theology, theology, and metaphysics. You tend to use them interchangeably, but when you drop political or metaphysics and you only use theology, which by itself implies religion, I think that you give a false representation. I don't think you mean to, but that needs really clarification. Otherwise, when you say there's a theology behind liberalism, it can be easily misunderstood.
Yeah.
Just a clarification.
God bless you.
Okay.
Thanks, David, and thanks for the presentation. It's worth coming all the way out to California for it. So I just had a practical question in regard to your understanding of liberalism, especially as presented by Schmitt, and looking at trying to reconcile both universality and particularity. Would that be applicable, do you think, with our current American political situation, where we have a left progressivism that seeks to be dominant, that seems to have some sense of universal values, but fragments them in terms of all these particularities in terms of identity? So you may have 5 different identities rooted all at once, sometimes with objectively different interests or understandings, but still clinging to this notion of some sort of universality around social justice. And yet this same left progressivism with the universalisms and the particularity don't particularly like white folk, and especially those in the Midwest and the South. So I wrote this essay, you may have seen it, in Telos, Can We Save Archie Bunker? And this notion that the left really has an antipathy toward just ordinary working class white folks who don't come to Telos conferences. And yet they now have the whip hand at this very moment. So I'm very interested to know, should liberalism extend more charity towards just ordinary people who want to go about their business?
Can I take a shot at that? Liberalism doesn't have the moral, intellectual, cultural capacity to do that as it's currently constructed. They're incapable. I mean, that's the deplorables, right? I mean, that's Obama. He should have been slapped. All these working class whites wanted their guns and their Bibles. Now, I'd have slapped him if I'd been there for disrespecting these people, because that's part of the problem. So, to your point, because what you're asking, Ken, do upmarket, Martha's Vineyard, Chilmark, liberals, right? Aspen and Davos, white people, right? Have the capacity morally or intellectually to engage in what they really view as white trash. That's their view. That's not gonna happen. Just politically. In fact, the irony is, and this is a conversation I'm having with black churches, my thing with my black, I said, listen, man, we gotta have a foreign policy for working class white people. The black church has to have a foreign policy for poor white people. Because if we can't build a bridge to them, it's all over. Because nothing will happen in this country unless the needs of that population, the legitimate needs, with an empathy for why they're as racist and crazy as they are. Because for me, I get Joe Sixpack. I understand when I see him and he's a cop from South Boston, and I come in with a tweed jacket or I've got some Alden shoes on, and so-and-so, who are you? And then he looks under my arm, I got the New York Times, and there is like mountains of stuff that I'm not responsible for, but I need to understand. There's some complex stuff here, and it's been the failure to engage and empathize with that reality, which is why the left is going to continue to fail in its current iteration.
I'm gonna jump in here and put a plug for my own paper on Sunday. That's what I talk about.
All right. I'm ready.
And-
I'll be in the pews.
And I'm going to add, I don't often quote Donald Trump, but he once was flying over Atlantic City with some pretty girls on his private jet.
Yes.
A little while ago, and one of them was from outside the US, and the language of white trash came up, and they asked him, so Donald, what is white trash? And he said, pointing basically down to Atlantic City, the people like me, just poor.
Deep. Yeah.
One thing that I'd like to hear you, I guess, riff on from this perspective for a moment is how the act of historical memory and the creation of historical memory or public historical memory is itself often an aesthetic act, right? The choice of how you create, the or a museum or what sorts of pieces of art you choose to preserve or present through the choices of archives and public history. Because people treat history museums, or ordinary people treat history museums very similarly to the way they treat art museums. Right? There's sort of a process of aesthetic construction and identity construction going on, and how people perceive statues and markers and things like that. So I'd love to hear just to get reflections from the distinguished folks here on how public history is itself sort of these same sets of aesthetic choices constituting the people, as you put it.
Maybe I'll respond to that because, and I guess partly to Adrian, because the way I'm understanding aesthetic is really focused on representations and how Schmitt obviously didn't really develop this idea, right? I mean, he tried, I think, but I don't think he had the conceptual tools. But the decision is fundamentally a representational moment. So that it's not. I don't really see it as voluntaristic, because it depends on exactly what you're talking about. A kind of an attempt to reinvent the past to come up with a new kind of representation of what that past means for us. And so that there's something, I guess a historian does that. There's a kind of art to the historian that's creating a story, a narrative of what the past means to us, right? And to the extent that it's reflected in museums, that becomes a kind of representational framework with which then people understand their own identity. Now, if that process goes on, it has to be a process of looking at your own sort of sources of influence and the ways in which that tradition is developed. You're right, Schmitt doesn't talk about that. He doesn't talk about the way in which that decision depends on that look at the tradition. But I don't see how you can really make sense of the decision unless you look at that, right? And that's how I'm kind of reading Schmitt, is saying, look, even though he didn't talk about it, we can't really make good sense of this concept of decision unless we include basically what Benjamin does in thinking through the messianic moment as an engagement with the past and trying to rethink the past, right? And that is not it's not a philosophical gesture. It's a representational one because it's what Charles Peirce describes as reducing the manifold to unity. Right? Because out of the entire multiplicity of things that are out there, you're choosing something to say, this is the truth of that, right? And that process is not in any way a philosophical one. It really is a kind of representational. It's an aesthetic one, because there are no principles by which you can reduce the multiplicity to unity, right? It is an aesthetic act. And that's why the decision also has to be a kind of unified thing, in the sense that you're reducing the multiplicity to unity. You're making a statement. And so a statement is going to be a statement. It's something that you can falsify, that you can say true or false. Now, I mean, to Marcia's point about the possibility of a kind of mixed sovereignty, I think there's that possibility. I mean, sort of what I talked about the Holy Roman Empire as a kind of model for more mixed sovereignty. You had the church, you had the empire, you had individual kings, you had the single knights, whatever, right? And all of that constituted a kind of mixed form of sovereignty in which there's constant conflict between these different authorities, and that's what kind of made everything fit, right? You're right, but Schmitt doesn't, he's kind of beyond that in the sense that he feels like, oh, the sovereignty has to be unified. But each source of sovereignty still has to make that decision about how to reduce the multiplicity to some kind of unity. Right? So anyway, that's, oh. Yeah. There's two more. Oh, yeah, there's two more. Is there somebody else?
I just had a quick couple of things. I think it's really interesting, like you said, kind of deriving and sort of organizing different ways to look at views of liberalism in like historically specific ways. However, I was kind of wondering how any of you really would think about that in terms of actual modern liberalism just through inventions like the internet. Like that you actually have to see this sort of definition of a people constantly in different ways and continually be sort of expanding that to whatever boundary they can really last within liberalism. At least that's how I see it, like interacting in those sort of communities. And whether or not that sort of is actually getting back to some of the things that have been floating around that, in my opinion, I keep getting critique of judgment in my head. But just that if you have that sort of plan for this sort of liberalization that would create almost a transnational situation rather than an individually national one, are you really having to redefine what it is to be a people in the same way? You kind of know what I mean? If this is really sort of a question of rethinking subjectivity in that manner as well.
Can I just say about, I mean, that's what I was trying to get at in what I was saying, but
right.
The argument keeps on going round and round because we can't understand liberalism by referring to the critique of judgment except for liberalisms that are Kantian.
Right.
That would be about 4% of the liberalisms. So we have to get the analysis right before we start. And we can't possibly talk about a people unless we've sorted out why a Volk is not a people and why no major East German government would ever have worried about killing the people in the name of the Volk. Now, if you don't make distinctions like that, again, you talk junk. Mm-hmm. And if you think that purpler means the same as people, then you're deaf. And if you think that in the British tradition we ever talked about the people, well, you don't know the history. People could be slaughtered tomorrow, they're not relevant. And last point, but it's very important, this talk as though government involves sovereignty. I wrote about 4 years ago with a number of very famous people, not me, on sovereignty, because we were clearing away the rubbish lawyers talk by showing, for example, that about a third of the states in the 19th century are not states and are not nations. Because people who don't study these things constantly produce the case they know and say it's all like that, isn't it? Well, no, it isn't. It mainly isn't like that. It's only in the last 10 years that the books have established that civil society doesn't exist in most countries in the world and not in any Muslim country. So let's stop running the idea that civil society is good and we can spread it around. You can't, it isn't there. So all these terms have to be given a sensitive dynamic to which country, to which period. Last point, if we want to talk about aesthetics, same argument all over again, great. But Benjamin and Schmitt are talking on the dates we know. But in those days, aesthetics is a kind of vulgar religion for the bourgeoisie who've given up the real stuff. Right. Now you can't use the word aesthetic in educated circles, sorry David, because aesthetics has been dumped by the political progressive for 25 years. And if you think you put aesthetics things into art galleries, you haven't been to them. We don't do that no more, mate. So I'm not criticizing anything said on our floor, but I'm saying we really have to get a lot sharper about country, time, and we can't take theorists from Germany or from any other country from the 30s or the 20s as the guide to now without noticing that the meaning of the words have changed. Yes. I mean, that's obvious. And just to play the German card for the last time, of course, whenever you're dealing with German or Russian or Chinese, you've got to remember that's not the meaning that you've been given. That's the wrong meaning. Okay, I mean, an example everyone here will know is that plausible in English has certain implications, but plausible in German is very bad. And as you also know, civilization and culture differ in meaning by every major European language. And last one, because it it took us off the track for nearly 40 years. Modernism has a different meaning in all European languages. And in Portuguese, it means the opposite to Spanish. And so when you decide we're living in postmodern times, and you're a postmodernist, and I'm the person who told Richard Rorty he was a postmodernist, he didn't know till I told him, you have to do it by country and culture and time. Otherwise, you talk in this meaningless way about historical material. Now, last point, because David is right at the end completely. Peirce is the answer. Yes, we agree as usual. And what does it mean? It means that you must go to generality. You must have universals. Of course, Adrian's right. But when you do that, you go to the philosophy. And by the philosophy, I don't mean French fake. I deal with French fake all the time. I've taught French fake. I knew half the French fakes of the 20th century. Lovely people. But we go to philosophy for generality, e.g. Peirce. If we want detail as to time, history. If we want detail as to politics, politics. If we want archaeology, well, don't listen to me. Go and talk to an archaeologist. Thank you.
Just reference part of the discussion here is, I think, overemphasis upon decisionism. And I think part of your problem could be solved if you realize by the early 1930s, Schmitt moved beyond this outmixed war in terms of sovereignty. We look at, starting with the three types of juristic thought in there, he offers a self-criticism of this earlier decisionism. And he does move more in the direction of tradition, culture, as a founding for so much of this. And you can see a continuity from that into the nomos even. So again, I think it's an overemphasis on something that Schmitt himself had perhaps grown beyond.
I think we're done with our session for today. Thank you for attending. So we're gonna reconvene tomorrow morning at
9 a.m. I'm looking. But before that, we have a wine reception at the back, so please stay.
9 a.m. and it won't be here. It will be in the Deutsches House of New York University.
Yeah.
Hall.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.